Looking for new spring outfits or decor? Shop St. Vinny's for quality clothing, furniture, and home goods. Thrifting's cheaper than shopping at big box stores or online, and April is Earth Month, so shopping at Vinny's is a great way to protect the planet. Plus, support local. All dollars spent at St. Vinny's stay in Dane County. Proceeds go to local food pantries, pharmacies, microloans, housing support, and more. Follow at Vinny's Dane County on Facebook and Instagram to be notified when special events are coming up or to see the latest finds in store. Looking for a summer experience your child will never forget? Camp Paw Print and Camp Wildside at Dane County Humane Society offer unforgettable opportunities to learn, explore, and grow while having fun. Perfect for kids ages 7 to 12, Camp Paw Print features hands-on animal encounters, crafts, themed lessons, and more. For youth ages 12 to 15, Camp Wildside offers unique themes focused on wildlife exploration, nature adventures, and conservation activities. Make lasting memories with these one-of-a-kind camps. Spots fill quickly, so register today at giveshelter.org/education. This is CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Today, the spring elections are just a week away on April 7th, and Wisconsinites will decide who is the next state Supreme Court justice. The two candidates vying for the seat are Waukesha-based District 2 Court of Appeals Judge Maria Lazar and Dane County-based District 4 Court of Appeals Judge Chris Taylor. Judge Maria Lazar joins me now. Judge Lazar, thank you for coming on CityCast Madison.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
You are the first person who is described as a conservative judge to accept our invitation over the last two cycles. So we really do appreciate it because we want to hear from everyone. And that's the goal, right? So thank you for taking the time. I just had to say that because we always want to hear from across the spectrum. And I know Madison has a reputation in both certain ways. But anyway, let's just get into it. Why should you be the next Wisconsin Supreme Court justice?
Well, first of all, I do want to say that I'm actually find that sad that I'm the first who's accepted your offer to talk. But the reason why I'm running and I believe I'm the better candidate in this race is that I have more judicial experience, almost 12 years on the bench. I'm an independent jurist. I have spent my entire life devoted to the law, not to any causes. I've never been a member of a political party. My opponent is still a Democrat. And she has about 4 years of judicial experience. I really think, though, that when you look at my past and you look at everything I've done leading up to this, I was born and raised in Wisconsin. I've only left 3 years when I went to Georgetown Law School. I came back. I worked for about 20 years defending small businesses, solo practitioners, employees, teachers. And then I worked for 5 years at the Department of Justice, and I represented state agencies and different people there. But I came to the law with a judge in Dane County who told me in a foster care case that the law didn't matter. And so since then, I've been a judge. I ran for judge. I've been elected now 3 times. And I just think that I bring a sense of independence, a sense of impartiality, and someone who, quite frankly, is a law nerd who loves the law and wants to serve Wisconsin.
Well, compared to the last state Supreme Court election, there's a lot less attention and money being spent on this race. That's in part, right, because the ideological majority of the court is not in question. But why is this race still important? What are the stakes?
So, yes, last year was a race to change the composition possibly of the state Supreme Court. This year, the race is not to do that, but this year the race is to sort of, in my view, draw a line in the sand and to say, we need to stop politicizing these judicial races. This is not a race for a politician. We need to stop putting individuals on that court who see it as a means to an end, who see an opportunity to change Wisconsin as a judge, which is something a legislator does. I think people in this state have lost faith in this court. I think they want someone there who they know will give them a fair opportunity to be heard. And I really think that sort of the heart and soul of our court is at stake.
And I want to dig into some of the political conversation later in this episode, but I want to start more or less with the key issues that are coming up in this race. Of course, we can't say for certain which cases the court will or won't hear in the future. That said, there's a possibility of major cases coming down the pike on Act 10, potentially on redistricting. Also, there are the perennial questions surrounding voting and election challenges and security. Why are you the strongest candidate to help rule on some of these major cases that might come down the line?
And that's an excellent question. And I will tell you that it's actually the wrong question, and I'll explain why.
Part of me thought, okay, go for it.
The reason why it's the wrong question is no matter which case comes up in front of the state Supreme Court, whether it's Act 10, elections, redistricting, or if it's something that people in the state don't pay attention to, insurance or burdens of proof for criminal cases, you need the same type of justice on the state Supreme Court. You need an individual who's going to look at every case only based on the facts and the law, and who will only make decisions not on what my personal views are, not on what my preferences are, only on the law and the facts, and that's all. So that applies if it's Act 10, redistricting, election, votes, whatever it is. You need someone there who's going to be that independent, impartial voice who will balance the court.
Well, I do want to dig into the experience and then get into the politics, because certainly partisan politics are surrounding everything. And I appreciate your point that you made at the beginning, which is we want to get away from that. So let's first, when we're talking about who's best suited for the court, bona fides matter. And you shared at the top that you think that you are the most qualified because of your experience between you and your opponent for this higher office. I'd like to understand that a bit better. And if you don't mind, I'll share a little bit of your professional background for listeners. You currently serve as a 2nd District Appeals Court judge based in Waukesha. Your career includes years of work at private practice law firms and serving as an assistant attorney general under Republican Attorney General J.B. Van Hollen. Is there anything in particular you want voters to know about your professional bona fides for this office, and why you think that Chris Taylor just is really paling in comparison?
Absolutely. So someone made a comment once that our resumes look the same, but they don't. And I'll explain why. So we both served time as circuit court judges, but my opponent spent 2 years in one rotation, and I spent 7 years on the Waukesha County Circuit Court bench. I started out in civil. I started out with a case that had to do with a $50 million, almost $100 million indenture bond, and I had to resolve that. And then I went into criminal. In criminal, I became presiding judge, which meant that I was in charge of that rotation and that division. And that was during COVID. Well, at the end of that was COVID. I was also the drug treatment court judge, which meant that I handled the cases where we have people in drug treatment court, where they're coming in every week, talking to us, trying to get over their addictions and become better. And then following that, I was the presiding judge in juvenile, which was a branch. And in Waukesha, juvenile covers everything. We're not like bigger counties where we break it up. So I dealt with termination of parental rights to juvenile delinquents. So I had the 2-year-old child who'd been beaten by their parents completely. And then I would have the case with the 8-year-old child who had been sexually assaulted since they were 6 and was now sexually assaulting other people. And I also in that rotation did mental commitments, which meant I had to look at all sorts of circumstances and whether people were mentally ill and they needed to be involuntarily committed or involuntarily medicated. So I did that for 7 years. My opponent did that for 2 in one rotation. Following that, I spent 4 years now on the Court of Appeals. My opponent spent about 2. I've sat in and resolved almost 800 appeals. And just this last week, I issued my most recent opinion that's going to be published. I mean, I've issued hundreds of them, but this is my 19th that's going to be published. And I just think the breadth of my experience in all these branches is something that I would bring to the court that my opponent cannot bring.
So a diversity of experience and additional years. I'll say we will be talking to Chris Taylor and ask her about that statement for sure. But let's turn to talking about partisanship, because that's one of the main issues I'm hearing from you about what distinguishes you and your opponent. And I'd love to understand why you personally wanted to run for the seat. What prompted you to join the race? And I'll just share, I've read that the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk played a role. Can you tell us more about that and why you're running?
Yes. So this wasn't in my contemplation last year. I was actually working at home, which you can do as a Court of Appeals judge. And I got a call from a reporter telling me that Rebecca Bradley had made an announcement, Justice Bradley. And that was in the beginning of September. I had looked at this race and I'd looked at this position and thought maybe in a year or two, it's where I was going to possibly run. But I took that month to spend the time to talk to my family and to say, I really think last year's race was somewhat horrible in that they spent $150 million or so. And the big question I always ask people on the campaign trail is, do you know anything about the judicial qualifications of either of those two candidates after they spent $150 million throwing mud back and forth? And the answer is no. So I took the time and I actually had a commitment with my family to do something and drive one of my children across country. And during that time, the Charlie Kirk assassination happened. And the child that I was with looked at me and said, why would you even want to run for a statewide office when this is what happens to people who put their names out there and put their lives out in front of the state of Wisconsin? And my answer immediately was that you cannot let something done by a coward change how you're going to react and what you're going to do. And I will say that in this race, there have been attacks, nothing physical. There have been verbal attacks, campaign ads. There have been, even before I decided to run, allies of my opponent were publishing statements saying that I better not get in the race. I'm only going to be sacrificed. I'm going to be kind of eviscerated, and insulting me and doing things like that. And I thought, you know what? We need to stop all of that on both sides. We need to have a campaign where the state of Wisconsin says, let's look at this candidate and let's look at that candidate and who's better judicially. And that's why I'm running.
Explore the wonders of science! Y'all, it's time for UW-Madison's Science Expeditions, the yearly UW campus-wide science open house. Yup, you heard that right. UW is opening its doors to their science labs and research centers to you and your family for free. From April 10th through the 12th, you can adventure around your top-tier public land-grant research university. You can talk with world-class researchers, enjoy science demos, and get hands-on at interactive exploration stations. The variety of programming is amazing. You can learn anything from what the inside of the human lung looks like to the science behind ice cream. You can even meet marmoset monkeys at the Primate Center. Again, UW-Madison's Science Expeditions events are free and open to all. So, see you at the open house? Find the full schedule at go.wisc.edu/science expeditions.
Get excited, Madison. The Sauce Night Market is returning to Garver Feed Mill on Friday and Saturday, April 10th and 11th from 5 to 10 p.m. It's a dedicated space to support emerging chefs, artists, and makers of all kinds, featuring over 50 local vendors. It's a curated market, meaning the Sauce team has put work into bringing you an all-star lineup of diverse vendors, emphasizing quality, creativity, and individuality. The market will feature food from our friends over at Sin City Smash, Mickey's Banks, and Ice Cream Social. And of course, you can bet there'll be some specialty cocktails too. Artist Hannah Brewer will be live painting during the event. The fantastic DJ Dudley Noon will provide the music. Plus, the CityCast Madison team will be there to say hi. The best part, the market is free to attend. That said, guests are encouraged to RSVP at saucemarket.com. Anyone who RSVPs can enter to win $50 to spend on the vendors. So don't miss it. Get your sauced on, and we'll see you there.
There have been some questions about your judicial beliefs and legal philosophy, and I would just like to ask you directly. You've called yourself a constitutional conservative, and you have the backing of the Republican lawmakers and donors in the state. But what does that label mean to you? Does that mean you hold right-wing values, or that you are a judicial conservative, or both?
I don't hold right-wing values in that personally I'm a little more fiscally conservative. I also am someone who loves the environment, so I don't think you can place me in any position. My husband's a nature photographer, so there are things I love and things I hold dearly to me. But as a judge, even when I was working at the Department of Justice, you can't be a member of a political party. And I've never been a member of a political party. And I've never voted like a straight ticket one way or another. But I've always been someone as a judge who says, the kind of judge I would like to be in front of is one who doesn't really tell you their personal views ever. It's sort of lonely that way. We don't tell people where we stand on things, but someone where if I have the facts and I have the law and I make my arguments, I'm going to win. So I've always looked at myself as an attorney's judge. I respect their work. I've done it for 25 years. I know where they're going. I know how they work. And I respect their advocacy and their time, and I don't waste that. And as a judge, I've always put my views, I like to say that we put them behind our black robe, and no one should ever think that there's any cause that they would have to worry about who they are in my court. And if it ever came to a time where there's someone in front of me, a former law partner, my two brothers are lawyers, I have a niece and nephew who are lawyers, they obviously can't be in my court. And I always take care to make sure that no one suspects that I have any bias whatsoever, and I really don't. And I have been transparent about my positions. I've set them out. So when people, call me one side or the other and they say names, it's just not true. And it's sad that people are looking at this race through that focus when the focus really should be, what have I done as a judge? And you can go on my website, judgemarialazar.com, and you can read the opinions I've written as a circuit court judge and as a court of appeals judge, and you can see that every day I try to get it right, and I try to just rule on the law, and that's it.
And for the legal nerds, the judicial nerds, when you say you're a constitutional conservative, do you mean judicial conservatism, emphasizing restricted judicial power, judicial constraint, adhering to precedent? What does that mean to you?
So that pretty much is a good summary, but I'll also add, I'm an individual who really believes in an originalistic view with some textualism. I don't think there's any defined judicial philosophy that I fall precisely under, but I like to look at the law as it's written. And I always joke and laugh because people say, oh, well, if the law is as written, then there's no issue. Well, if the law was very clear, we wouldn't have a lawsuit. So you have a lawsuit because two sides are saying the law says something differently. So I always look to the words, to what it says, to what the heading is, to what the statutes around it say. And then my view is I can start going out a little bit and I can start looking at other statutes. I can start looking at dictionaries. But when you start getting too far and when you start getting to the point where you're looking at what's the intent of a legislator, we can never tell their intent because, quite frankly, there's so many of them. Whose intent am I looking at? And next, you have to sort of stay within your lines. And I will tell you, there are cases where I've looked at the law and I've said, gee, I really don't think the legislature meant that, but they wrote it, it says it, and I cannot put my views on. So what I'll do is interpret it the way they wrote it, and then I write a somewhat, maybe a little bit sarcastic footnote and basically say, hey, if the legislature didn't mean this, then they should address this, they should look at it, they should fix it, because right now they didn't add the comma, or they didn't add the phrase, or they didn't define the word, and I'm not going to do it for them. That's my view on judicial philosophy.
So a form of restraint.
Yes.
Yeah, I appreciate you laying that out because there's a lot of questions about major cases and precedents like Roe v. Wade had 50 years of precedent, and looking at the 1849 abortion ban, and all of this is really important to get into. And this is a nonpartisan race. So you'll notice we didn't start this conversation with me saying conservative or liberal leaning. We grapple with that as journalists on how to describe these races. But how would you share with a voter who's not voting in the election on partisan lines that they can have confidence in you as a fair and impartial arbiter of the law? Like, do you have an example from your record that highlights your capacity for impartiality?
Yes. So I would think that when you're looking at a judge from the outside and not being a lawyer or a judge, what are you looking for? And this is what I think you're looking for. You're looking for a judge who has not always ruled in the way that you would think they would, and in fact has ruled against groups or sides that you would think they'd be aligned with. So, for example, when I was on the circuit court, there are times where, one, I had the district attorney's office, they withheld evidence in a matter with a very serious crime. And they withheld evidence. And when it was finally brought to light 20 years after this person was in prison, I looked at it and I said, that was a significant amount of evidence that they withheld. And it really would have impacted a jury. And so I sent it back, vacated the conviction, and said they had to have the trial over. In another case, the police had a search warrant, and in my view, they were looking at drug dealers in a house, and instead they also went to the tenant who was living in the basement, and they searched his cell phone. And that was in excess of what you're allowed to do. I mean, the Constitution is very clear. You can't just search anybody you want and just take their cell phone and find anything you want. And so in those two cases, I ruled against sides that you would think I would be aligned with. On the Court of Appeals, there have been at least 2 or 3 opinions, maybe even more, where I've ruled against the Department of Justice, my former employer. And that's because I think, and I stand by, the view that they were wrong and that they either followed the law incorrectly or they were interpreting something incorrectly. So I think when you look at a judge, you say, is this a person who follows the law over their causes? Is this a person where you have faith moving forward that if it's a case that impacts something that they like, that they're going to make the right decision? And I think in this race, I've demonstrated that I'm the only candidate who's done that. And I think I'm the only candidate moving forward who is going to do that. And I have great fears that the current Supreme Court and my opponent right now have decided that, I mean, they've stated they think they have a mandate to act in a certain way. We're not legislators. We don't have mandates. We are supposed to only rule on the law. We are kind of the least sexy, exciting branch of government. And that's for a reason, because we do the important work, the boring, legal, law-based work, but we don't get out there and we don't get the rallies and the parades, and we don't talk to people about what we're going to do to improve their lives. That's a legislator, not the judge.
I guess I would love to get your point of view on Justice Bradley, whose seat you're running for. She stepped away, decided not to run for re-election, in part because the best path in her, quote, fight for liberty is not a minority member of the court. What do you make of that statement? You're obviously not Justice Bradley, but it could signal to others that people who have been on the court are holding political views that they're hoping get executed on the court on both political, ideological sides.
And I won't speak for Justice Rebecca Bradley. I will say that personally, I found it sadly disappointing that members of the current court have decided that there are disagreements on cases. And I'm full well of the opinion that you can disagree with another judge all you want. And actually, that's a good thing. I mean, we need that diversity of judicial thought and philosophy. But in fact, we just had a conference this week and on the Court of Appeals, and we were fighting over cases and how to resolve them and what to do. But the problem I have with our current Supreme Court is they're bringing those fights out into the public and they're putting them in their written decisions. They're writing dissents and statements, so for people that don't understand cases a lot, there's a majority and they write an opinion. And then there's a dissent where the justices, one or more, say they disagree and why. It used to be, I mean, I'd laugh that judges would always do this. Justices would do this. If they dissented, they'd say, I respectfully dissent. And then they'd say everything. And then they'd end with, I respectfully dissent. And it was always a joke in the legal community that if a judge was really annoyed, that they would say, I dissent. Not respectfully. They would just take out that one word, which is fine. But now you're seeing it on the United States Supreme Court and our Wisconsin State Supreme Court, where these justices are writing and disparaging each other personally. And that is not acceptable. This is a court where we are supposed to be the adults in the room. We're supposed to be the ones who are setting the pace for the judiciary for the state. We should not be having petty fights. Well, we can have our fights behind the scenes. We're not supposed to be doing that in public. And so when I see the justices do this and I see some of the bitterness, I think that I'm the perfect candidate to bring there because on my Court of Appeals, I'm the judge who acts as the mediator. I conciliate between opposing sides and I bring people together. And my goal is always unanimity to get a decision that we all agree on. And I will drop sections out of my opinions if I can get a unanimous decision, or I will add them. And if it's a worst case scenario and you have to dissent, and I've been dissented against, I at least do it respectfully. I never say the other side is stupid. They don't understand the law. I don't insult them. I say, I respectfully dissent. The law, in my view, says X. I disagree with the majority, and here's why. And then I respectfully dissent. I think we need a dose of that on our state Supreme Court.
A dose of dignity and decency. And as you said earlier, just fear of threats from the public. The heat in our political sphere is so high. And as you said, the judicial branch is supposed to be unsexy. And so when this drama is leaking out, it is something to see, and it does cause concern. The last note that I will bring up, as you mentioned, that you've stayed pretty clean out of politics. I have seen that you're a member of and have spoken 3 times before the Conservative Federalist Society, similar to U.S. Supreme Court Justices Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, John Roberts, Clarence Thomas, and Amy Coney Barrett. All of them have strong ties to the society. What do you say about that?
Well, and the interesting thing is I know some judges have been board members or executive members. I've never done that. I've been a member of that society because I am the total law geek. When the U.S. Supreme Court issues their opinions on their opinion day, I actually am the person who has it up on my computer and I watch when they're reading the opinions and I keep track of them. And I'm so boring that I get an opinion on criminal law. And when I was on the circuit court, I'd send it to every criminal judge or family cases to those. But the reason I'm a member of that society is there aren't a lot of groups that we can go to learn about the law. And the one thing I like about them is there's a diversity of thought. Every panel usually has 2 points of view. I've moderated a few where we have the left and the right and the middle, and we all talk about those. I also am aligned with other groups, and I've gone to seminars and events from groups that are very, very liberal. And the reason I do that is they talk about the constitutions, the state constitutions versus federal. And so any group that puts on any bit of education, I love and I attend. And that's me. I'm the law geek. I love it.
Well, as mentioned, this race has been much quieter than the last 2 elections for Wisconsin Supreme Court, certainly less money. Do you think that has been better or harder for your campaign personally?
Well, one, obviously we're nowhere near the money from last year. And in this campaign as well, my opponent started out saying that I was going to bring in all this billionaire money from out of the state. And actually I haven't, and I'm not seeking that. And my opponent's bringing in money from out of state and her side. And I think the money is always helpful. Yes. But I think it also shows my opponent has spent about 5.6 million on ads. And at this point in time, 53% of the people in my state of Wisconsin don't know who they want to vote for because they don't like what they've seen so far. And if you go to my website, and I have about 45, now almost 50 pages of substance, my opinions, my positions, my philosophy, what I've done in my life, how I got here, why I became a judge. And you go to my opponents and she has 4. And all they talk about are, here's why I'm running, basic paragraph or 2. Here's my philosophy, which is people-based, which I will tell you doesn't exist. And then here's who endorsed me, and here's how you can give me money. There's no substance there at all. And I think the people in Wisconsin, the Marquette poll said almost 84% want to hear from their judges. So I have been putting out statements unlike any other judicial candidate. I've been putting out statements on abortion, on redistricting, on religious freedom. I'm working on something as well that I hope to get out on the fact that we have an entirely awful shortage of state public defenders, and it is damaging people and their rights, their liberties, their freedom. And I don't think the public knows that people sit in jail for months and months and months before they even talk to a lawyer to find out maybe there was no charge against them at all. And it's appalling, but no one pays attention. So I'm trying to use this platform as well to speak about that.
Sometimes up to a year, right?
Yes, it's awful.
I do have a note that you have received money from a billionaire inside the state, Elizabeth Uline. So money is a part of the game, right?
I honestly wish it wasn't, because I wish in my perfect world, which I always say, and there isn't my perfect world. In my perfect world, people would get together and they'd ask lawyers who'd appeared in front of the judges, and they'd say, who do you respect? And they'd ask judges, who do you respect? And people would get that information. It would be put in a forum where both of us would talk and answer questions, and that information would be sent around the state and everyone would see it, and it's not. So what I've done is I think I've answered about 16 surveys from any group who sends it to me. The Muslim Civil Alliance, the Hmong community, the Fraternal Order of the Police. I just got one on legislators igniting technology, or leaders igniting technology. And I think it's so important to just get the word out about who I am, what I stand for, and why the courts actually matter. Because a lot of people say, well, since you're not flipping the court, who cares? Well, I care, and they should all care.
I heard you say my Wisconsin, born and raised here. I should know this. Is Chris Taylor not from Wisconsin?
No. So
Okay.
I was born in Milwaukee, and then my family moved to Waukesha. I've lived here my entire life, but for those 3 years at law school. My opponent, Chris Taylor, was born in California, raised there through high school, and then came to Wisconsin. And I know anyone can choose whatever state you want, and you can live where you want, but I just feel like I have Wisconsin in me. I mean, I'm the original fish fry, fried cheese curd girl. I love this state with everything in me. And I will say this race has been so phenomenal because even though I think I've been everywhere in Wisconsin, we've gone to places I've never seen before. And I love the Driftless area. I love way up north. I love everything, every city. It's been amazing. So when I say my Wisconsin, I am making that point that it is my Wisconsin.
Okay, well heard. Definitely heard that. And I ask in part because before I let you go, we do want to end on one fun question, which is, what is your favorite thing about being a Wisconsinite?
I think I just said that. I think my favorite thing, aside from never knowing what the weather is going to be the next minute, my favorite thing is actually the fact that the people are so nice. When I was in college, I spent a semester at New York going to the United Nations. It was phenomenal. It was wonderful. And we were a group of students from all over the country doing this United Nations semester. And the one thing that I always found funny was they would all say, "Oh, we can tell you're from Wisconsin because you're actually really nice." And so looking at this campaign and going through and talking to people, they're really nice. Even people who don't agree with me, and even people who say they're not going to vote for me, I've still been hugged by them. I've still been wished well by them. And I think Wisconsin nice is a reality. And I think we should never lose it. And I'm saddened when I see people who are bitter and they're fighting about things. And I think this is such a great state and great people. And that's what I like the best.
I love that answer. And all I've received from you is deep respect from all of your answers and kindness, and just super appreciate you coming on this show, being somehow the first identified as conservative candidate for this Wisconsin Supreme Court to do so. We don't bite. Thank you, Judge Lazar, for making the time.
And actually, I will tell you that when I'm successful on April 7th, that after that, I will promise you I will come back. Not before I've started, but I'll come back and tell you how wonderful the court is now and how we're working better or what we're going to do to make it better. But I will come back and talk to you about the court anytime you want.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
That's 2nd District Appeals Court Judge Maria Lazar, candidate for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Tune in tomorrow for a conversation with her opponent, Chris Taylor. That's all for today, here on CityCast Madison. I'm your host, Bianca Martin. Don't forget, you can support the show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Madison neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. And if you enjoyed today's show, why don't you share this episode with someone who votes? All right, we'll be back tomorrow morning with more coverage of the election. Until then, thanks for listening, and are you registered to vote? Go vote!